Hey Reddit, have you ever felt like your entire life was balanced on a knife's edge? That's exactly where I found myself 10 years ago, staring into an abyss that I didn't create but couldn't ignore. I need to share something with you all. And believe me, it's been a journey. My father, Douglas Hayes, built our company from scratch. He was brilliant at what he did, developing innovative solutions for businesses. But when it came to managing money, that's where things got complicated. By the time I finished my MBA at Stanford at 28, the company was hemorrhaging cash. Dad, now 62, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, the stress visibly aging him. And my older brother Blake? At 33, he was too busy living the high life to notice our company was dying. While I was pulling all-nighters, learning about supply chains and financial models, Blake was posting Instagram stories from exclusive clubs and private yacht parties. He had this effortless charm that made him everyone's favorite. Always had, always will. The golden boy who could do no wrong. I'd grown used to it, but that didn't make it sting any less. Another post from Blake? My colleague whispered one day, showing me his phone. There he was, my brother, popping champagne at some rooftop bar, while I was neck-deep in spreadsheets, trying to save our family legacy. I just shook my head and turned back to my work. This wasn't about him. This was about something bigger. Late night at home. One night, I found Dad in his home office, surrounded by what looked like a paper hurricane of unpaid invoices and breached contracts. The soft glow of his desk lamp cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look older than his years. He didn't even notice me standing in the doorway. His dual monitors displayed a maze of red numbers, and his usual neat desk looked like it had been hit by a financial tornado. "Dad?" I called softly. When he finally looked up, his eyes were distant, almost vacant. "I think this is it, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this anymore." His words hit me like a physical blow. Maybe it was the defeat in his voice, or the way his shoulders slumped, but something inside me shifted in that moment. "I'll handle it," I promised, my voice stronger than I felt. He didn't argue, didn't even question it. Looking back, I think he was just relieved that someone, anyone, was willing to step up. At the office. From that day forward, I practically lived at the office. I immersed myself in every aspect of how the company operated, or more accurately, how it was failing. Between my MBA training and countless sleepless nights studying coding tutorials, I started to see patterns in the chaos. I dove into the numbers, renegotiated contracts, and personally met with every client who walked through our doors. Most of them didn't want to hear from me at first. "Aren't you Douglas's younger son?" they'd ask, skepticism dripping from their voices. I was young, just 28, and they'd already lost faith in our company. I can't count how many times I heard no or had doors practically slammed in my face. But I kept showing up, armed with data and solutions. People notice persistence, you know? Even the most cynical clients started taking me seriously after a while. That first year was brutal. I worked 16-hour days minimum, fueled by coffee and determination. While Dad remained the official CEO, he gave me free rein to make decisions. One of my first moves was slashing unnecessary expenses, including Blake's more extravagant charges. He had this habit of treating the company account like his personal ATM, and nobody had ever stopped him. Until I did. Confrontation. I remember Blake storming into my office one afternoon, waving his declined credit card like a flag of war. His designer suit was immaculate as always, but his face was red with anger. "Look at you, playing CEO," he sneered, leaning over my desk. His gold watch glinted under the office lights. "Don't get too comfortable, little brother. Dad won't let you take over." He tossed a stack of denied expense reports onto my keyboard. I kept my eyes on my monitor, calmly continuing to type. Those were personal expenses, Blake. They're not company business. Everything I do is company business, he shot back. I'm the face of this company. These parties, these connections, they're all for the business. I finally looked up at him. The business that's failing? The one you haven't actually worked at in years? My voice remained steady, even as I felt my anger rising. The parties stop now, Blake. We can't afford them anymore. He laughed, but it wasn't his usual charismatic chuckle. It was something harder, colder. We'll see about that, Ethan. We'll see. As he strode out, I could hear him already on his phone, no doubt calling Dad to complain. I knew how this game worked. Blake was the favorite, always had been. He got credit for things he never did, and second chances for his mistakes. But I wasn't doing this for approval anymore. I was doing it because I refused to watch my father's legacy crumble while my brother posted selfies from private jets. 1 year later, by the end of that first year, things started turning around. We weren't thriving yet, but we'd stopped drowning. Our reputation began to rebuild, piece by piece. Clients who'd once refused to meet with me started calling back. Employees began to walk with more confidence, no longer whispering about layoffs by the coffee machine. Most importantly, the company was actually turning a profit. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible I could build on. But success, I learned, doesn't solve everything. During our weekly family dinners, I'd watch Dad beam with pride at Blake's empty chair, going on about his natural business acumen while I sat there with financial reports pulled up on my phone. It was surreal, me calculating expansion strategies between bites while everyone discussed Blake's latest social media updates. Your brother has such an incredible network, Dad would say, showing Mom some photos on his phone. Look at him with the CEO of Tech Solutions. That kind of networking is invaluable. I didn't mention that the networking photo was from a nightclub at 2 a.m., or that Tech Solutions had turned down 3 meeting requests from us that month. What was the point? I'd decided early on that I didn't need the credit. If Blake wanted to take all the glory, fine. I had bigger goals in mind. Sure, Dad's approval would have been nice, but what mattered was building something sustainable, something I could look at and say, yes, I did that. Company transformation. Over the next few years, the company underwent a complete transformation. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were innovating. I introduced new digital services, developed proprietary software solutions, and expanded into markets we'd never even considered before. Revenue grew from barely scraping by to hitting 8 figures, then crossed into 9. I remember standing in my office one evening, looking out over the city skyline, when a notification popped up on my phone. Our stock had just hit another all-time high. The company that was once on the brink of collapse had become an industry leader. I should have felt elated, but there was this underlying tension I couldn't shake. Blake wasn't as absent anymore. As our success grew, he started showing up at the office more frequently, acting like he'd been an integral part of our transformation all along. He'd walk through the halls in his expensive suits, clapping people on the back like he'd been there through the tough times. Everyone knew better, but nobody said anything. Not even Dad. Looking back, that should have been my first warning sign. Blake couldn't stand that the spotlight wasn't solely on him anymore. His jokes about how I was too serious or needed a life outside the office had an edge to them now, like he was building up to something. I could feel it, but I kept my head down and focused on my work. I wasn't going to let his insecurities destroy everything I'd worked so hard for. That was my first mistake. By the time we hit $150 million in revenue, the cracks were starting to show. I just hadn't realized how deep they went. The shareholders' meeting. I knew something was wrong the moment Dad called for the shareholders' meeting. It wasn't unusual for him to gather us, but something felt different this time. The email subject line, critical announcement regarding company future, had a finality to it that made my stomach churn. I assumed it was about his retirement. After all, he'd been talking about stepping back for years, especially now that the company was stable. I wasn't nervous as I walked into our top floor boardroom that morning. If anything, I felt prepared. I'd been running the company without the title for years, and this meeting seemed like a formality to make it official. I wasn't looking for applause, but it seemed like the logical next step. Who else could take over? Blake arrived late, naturally. Classic Blake. I was already at the boardroom table reviewing my quarterly projections when he sauntered in like he owned the place. His tailored suit probably cost more than most employees' monthly salary, and he was working the room like a politician, all smiles, handshakes, and practiced jokes. Everyone seemed charmed by him, as usual. That's the thing about Blake. You almost forgot he'd never actually done anything to earn their respect. He had a talent for making people feel like he belonged, even when he didn't. He threw me a wink as he took his seat, which made my stomach twist. Not because I was afraid. Blake had never been a real threat, but because it seemed calculated, premeditated. I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the presentation I'd prepared. The announcement. Dad walked in a few minutes later, looking worn but determined. He started his usual spiel about the company's history, how much it meant to him, how proud he was of what we'd accomplished. It was a bit over the top, even for him. He loved setting the stage before dropping big news. When he finally got to the point, he stood up, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. It's time for me to pass the torch. He paused, looking around the room as if expecting applause. After careful consideration, I've decided that Blake will be taking over as CEO. I swear time stopped for a second. My brain refused to process what I just heard. Blake as CEO? This had to be some kind of joke. I looked at my brother, and he was beaming from ear to ear, not surprised, not caught off guard, just grinning. That's when it hit me. He'd known. He'd known all along. I didn't have time to process this because Dad was still talking. I believe Blake embodies the leadership qualities this company needs moving forward. Leadership qualities? The guy who couldn't show up to a meeting on time? The one whose only contribution to the company was depleting our entertainment budget for years. Before I could say anything, Blake stood up, clutching a leather portfolio I'd never seen before. I'd like to address something important, he said, his tone formal, which was almost comical coming from him. He opened the portfolio and started flipping through pages, making a show of it. The betrayal. Over the past few months, Blake continued, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. I've discovered some concerning irregularities in how certain decisions have been made. He glanced at me, then at the board members, gauging their reactions. It appears my brother has been operating outside his authority. The words hit me like a physical blow. I watched in stunned silence as he proceeded to accuse me of making unauthorized deals, exceeding my authority, and compromising the company's reputation. He painted me as some kind of reckless, power-hungry rebel who'd run amok while Dad was distracted. It was all cleverly worded, just vague enough to sound plausible without providing any actual evidence. I started to stand, ready to defend myself, but Dad cut me off. Let him finish, he said, his tone calm but firm. The betrayal in those two words stung more than anything Blake was saying. I only bring this up because I care deeply about the company's future, Blake concluded, his face a mask of fake concern. We need to ensure we maintain the highest level of integrity. Integrity? Coming from Blake. The irony was almost too much to bear. When he finished, The room fell into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to Dad, who took a deep breath and delivered the final blow. After reviewing the situation, I've decided to terminate Ethan's employment, effective immediately. The exit. My world collapsed in slow motion. 2 security guards appeared by the door. They must have been waiting for this moment. I didn't fight it. I didn't even speak. What was there to say? This decision had been made long before this meeting, and I'd walked right into their trap. As I gathered my things, Blake leaned over and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Nothing personal, little brother. Just business." That's when I realized this wasn't just about the company. This was about him proving something. To me, to Dad, to anyone who'd ever compared us. He didn't care about the company's future, he cared about taking it from me. I walked out of that boardroom with all the dignity I could muster, but inside, I was seething. Not just at being blindsided, but at how Blake had twisted years of hard work against me. He hadn't just taken my job, he'd stolen my narrative. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already flooding with texts from coworkers, friends, and even a few board members who were shocked by what had happened. I ignored them all. I needed to think. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the meeting over and over, trying to figure out how I'd missed the signs. The aftermath. Looking back, all the signs had been there. Blake showing up at the office more frequently, Dad being unusually secretive, even some board members acting distant lately. I'd been so focused on running the company that I'd missed the storm brewing right under my nose. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours, trying to make sense of it all. How could Dad, who'd watched me pour my life into this company, choose Blake? Was it blind loyalty, favoritism, or was I just that replaceable in his eyes? Whatever the reason, one thing was crystal clear. I was out, and Blake was in. But here's the thing about Blake. He's great at playing the part, but terrible at seeing the bigger picture. While he was busy celebrating his victory, he hadn't realized I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Far from it. I'd spent years building more than just a business. I'd built leverage. While they were plotting my downfall, they hadn't bothered to check how deep my roots went. The strategy. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Blake directly. That's what he expected and wanted. A chance to paint me as bitter and vindictive. No, I was going to do something much smarter. I was going to wait, and when the time came, I'd remind them all who really built this empire. The first thing I did was contact key employees who'd been with the company through thick and thin. These weren't the flashy executive types. They were the company's backbone, the IT team, several senior developers, and 2 managers who'd worked alongside me during those early struggling years. I knew they'd answer my calls because, unlike Blake, I'd taken the time to build real relationships. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't have to. All I said was that there was a lot happening behind the scenes, and if they trusted me, they should wait a few days before making any major decisions. Nobody questioned it. Nobody hesitated. That told me everything I needed to know about their loyalty. The setup. Next, I focused on the infrastructure. The advantage of rebuilding a company from the ground up is that you know where every piece fits. Over time, I'd quietly established a separate company to manage our most valuable assets: intellectual property, customer contracts, proprietary software. On paper, it was just a support company designed to streamline operations. In reality, it was the heart of the business, and I owned it completely. Why hadn't I told anyone about it? Because I'd always known something like this might happen. Maybe not exactly this, but I'd had a feeling Blake would try some kind of power play eventually. The evidence. As for Dad, well, I'd given up expecting him to have my back a long time ago. With everything in place, I spent the rest of the weekend gathering receipts, metaphorically speaking. I combed through years of documents, emails, contracts, and bank records, collecting evidence of Blake's negligence, mismanagement, and outright shady dealings. Some were minor: excessive spending, missed deadlines. Others were more serious: backdoor dealings with competitors, questionable transactions, moves that had put the company at risk. By Sunday night, I had a folder thick enough to stop a bullet, but that wasn't the end game. I wasn't out to completely destroy Blake. That would have been too easy, and it wouldn't accomplish anything. My goal was to remind everyone, Blake, Dad, and the board, why I was the one who had turned this company around in the first place. Monday morning. I woke up earlier than usual on Monday, not because I had anywhere to be, but because I wanted to watch the aftermath unfold in real time. I brewed my premium coffee, set up my laptop in my home office, and connected to the company's internal network. Yes, I still had access. You'd think someone like Blake, with all his supposed leadership qualities, would have thought to revoke my credentials immediately, but no. The first thing I did was activate the failsafe I'd programmed into the system years ago. No viruses or malicious code, just a simple script that routed all internal communications through a secure server under my control. Emails, memos, meeting invites, everything went through me first. Then I turned my attention to Blake's computer. Again, no hacking necessary. He hadn't even changed his password. Still the same one he'd used since college. I uploaded a video file to his desktop and set it to play automatically when he logged in. The video? A highlight reel of his worst decisions, complete with timestamps and supporting documentation. Nothing flashy or dramatic, just a cold, hard reminder of his incompetence. The unraveling. By 8:15 a.m., the chaos had begun. Blake walked into the office looking smug as ever, and I watched through the security feed as he sat down at the CEO's desk, turned on his computer, and leaned back in his chair like he owned the place. A second later, the video started playing. His expression went from confused to panicked in seconds. His face turned red as he frantically tried to close the file, but it kept playing on every screen in his office. The collapse. Meanwhile, the notifications started rolling in. Board members, department heads, and major investors' inboxes began filling up one by one with emails. Each contained a piece of evidence I'd gathered, along with a brief explanation of how Blake's actions had harmed the company. I kept the tone professional. No accusations, just facts and figures. In the lobby, federal agents were walking through the front door. I'd informed the authorities about some of Blake's more questionable financial practices, and they were ready to have a conversation with him. The cherry on top? An email from the entire IT department announcing their resignation. They'd all signed contracts with my subsidiary and were no longer employed by the main company. The email ended with a simple statement: "We stand with the person who built this company." I watched through the security feed as Blake tried to hold it together. He called IT support. No answer. He called Dad. Straight to voicemail. He even tried calling me at one point, but I let it ring. By mid-morning, the board had called an emergency meeting. Blake was summoned, and from what I saw on the security stream, it wasn't a friendly conversation. By noon, he was being escorted out of the building. The aftermath. The news spread like wildfire. By afternoon, whispers were circulating about federal agents, Blake's departure, and the CEO being walked out. In the age of instant communication, chaos like this can't be contained. By the next morning, rumors had become headlines. Company scandal rocks leadership team. No names yet, but everyone knew who they were talking about. The stock price didn't just drop, it plummeted. Investors started pulling out the moment they realized the company's core assets were no longer under its control. That was intentional, of course. The subsidiary I'd set up to house everything had been legally independent for years, and it was now the foundation of my new venture. Blake had inherited a shiny, empty shell. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I wasn't about to show up in the middle of this, looking like someone rubbing salt in the wound. I'd already done enough to disrupt Blake's supposed authority. The next step wasn't about me. It was about the people who actually made the company run. The new beginning. That morning, I sent an email to every employee. Subject line: a new opportunity. It was short and to the point. To the current staff, you've witnessed the events of the past day. Many of you are probably concerned about your future. I want you to know that your hard work and dedication haven't gone unnoticed. I'm inviting you to join a new organization where your contributions will be valued, your jobs will be secure, and you'll be working with leaders who prioritize innovation and honesty. Your positions and benefits will remain unchanged, with increased support and opportunities for growth. If you're interested, you can learn more here. Link. There's no pressure. This is entirely your choice. Thank you for everything you've done. You deserve better, and I hope I can provide that. Ethan. By the end of the day, my inbox was flooded with responses. People weren't just signing on. They were thanking me for giving them an out. It was surreal reading notes from people who'd stuck with the company through its darkest days, telling me they believed in me, not the organization that had just imploded. Over 93% of the employees accepted the offer. The fallout. Blake, on the other hand, wasn't doing so well. By midweek, the investigation into his financial activities had gone public. That's when the real dirt came out. It turned out he'd been siphoning money through fake vendor contracts. He'd also been selling client information to competitors for under-the-table payments. I'd known about some of it, but seeing it all laid out in black and white was staggering. The authorities moved quickly. Blake was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and a host of other charges. He made bail, but his reputation was destroyed. The media had a field day portraying him as the poster child for nepotism gone wrong. Every aspect of his escapades, the parties, the reckless spending, the backroom deals, was brought to light. Family matters. And Dad. He went radio silent for those first few days, probably trying to process what had just happened. I can only imagine how he felt when he realized that the son he'd trusted and favored for decades had turned out to be a massive liability. The board wasn't spared either. The remaining investors demanded answers, and the remaining members scrambled to minimize the damage. But what could they say? The company's foundation had been pulled out from under them. Everything that made the business valuable was now integrated into my new operation. The new company. That week, I met with the leadership team of my new company. These were the people who had followed me out of the chaos. The IT director, head of operations, key managers, and the core development team. We sat around a conference table in our new office space, one I'd secretly secured months before. Nothing fancy, just an efficient, modern setup with room to grow. First order of business, I began, is making sure everyone feels stable here. No tricks, no games. We've all been through enough of that. Everyone around the table nodded. I could see relief in their faces. For years, they'd been caught in the crossfire of poor leadership and favoritism. Now they could focus on their work without wondering what Blake would do next. The resolution, the transition, wasn't without its challenges. As expected, there were legal hurdles, and some clients needed extra reassurance that this was the right move. But overall, things went smoother than I'd anticipated. By the end of the month, we were fully operational, and I could finally breathe a little easier. Meanwhile, the original company continued its downward spiral. With no assets, no leadership, and no clear path forward, it became a cautionary tale in the corporate world. The stock price, artificially inflated by years of hype, was now worth pennies. Investors fled, Lawsuits piled up, and the remaining staff struggled to find new positions. Blake, predictably, tried to spin the story in his favor. He gave an interview to a local paper claiming he'd been set up and that the investigation was politically motivated. It didn't land. By that point, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and even Dad wouldn't defend him publicly. The confrontation. A week after Blake's public humiliation, I got the call I'd been expecting. Not from Blake, but from Dad. He'd been keeping his distance since everything went south, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he reached out. He left a brief, direct message on my phone. "We need to talk. Your mother and I are coming to see you tomorrow." I didn't respond. What was there to say? I knew exactly why he was calling. This wasn't about an apology, and it certainly wasn't about admitting he'd made a mistake. No, this was about the fallout. The tanking stock price, the lawsuits, the investors bailing out, and the fact that his entire retirement fund was now invested in a company that was essentially worthless. The next morning, Dad and Mom arrived at my new company's office right on time. I'd kept the place low-key, but I wasn't hiding. They found me easily enough. When they walked in, I noticed how much they'd aged in such a short time. Dad looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Mom's eyes were red from crying. They sat across from me in the small conference room, tension thick in the air. Dad spoke first. "Ethan," he said, his voice strained, "you've made your point, but we need to figure out how to fix this." I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "What exactly do you want fixed? The mess Blake made of the company? The company you let him destroy? Or the fact that your retirement savings are worthless?" Mom flinched, and Dad's expression hardened. "This isn't the time for blame," he said, trying to stay calm. "We're family. We need to come together and work this out." I almost laughed. Now he wanted to talk about family? After years of letting Blake walk all over me? After firing me in the most humiliating way possible? Now he cared about unity. "You don't get to play the family card now, Dad," I said quietly. "You made it pretty clear where your loyalty lies." He sighed deeply and ran a hand over his face. "I didn't know what Blake was doing," he told me. "Didn't you?" I shot back. "You might not have known the specifics, but you knew he was unqualified. You knew he was overspending. You knew he rarely showed up, and you still handed him control anyway,